factories roared. Smoke filled the sky. And deep inside those brick walls, men and women worked 12-hour shifts just to keep food on the table. But what kind of food? Well, most of the time, it wasn't food, it was survival. During the early 1900s through the Great Depression, factory workers across America didn't eat for pleasure. They ate to stay alive. No fancy lunches, no lunchboxes filled with sandwiches and soda. Just scraps, starch, and whatever could stretch through the week. Imagine a steelworker unwrapping a piece of bread spread thin with lard, or a young woman in a textile mill spooning cold cornmeal mush from a tin. These weren't gourmet meals. They were symbols of grit, of resilience, of families who refused to give up when the odds were stacked against them. Every meal told a story, of hands blistered from machines, of mothers who turned onions and potatoes into something warm, of fathers who came home with only a few coins but somehow made sure everyone ate. Today, we're diving back into those factory cafeterias and lunch pails to rediscover 10 forgotten factory worker meals that helped our grandparents, and sometimes even their parents, survive the toughest times in American history. These recipes might look strange now, but they fed a nation built on sweat and hope. So before we dig in, take a second to hit subscribe. Because here on Vintage Life of USA, we keep the stories of forgotten American kitchens alive, one lost meal at a time. It wasn't really a sandwich. It was survival disguised as one. In the dim morning light, coal miners packed their tin lunch pails before heading into the pits, not with meat or cheese, but with 2 slices of bread, soaked in water. They called it the water sandwich. Sometimes, if they were lucky, they'd sprinkle a pinch of salt or a thin smear of lard between the slices. But most days it was just damp bread, pressed together to keep the hunger away. During the early 1900s, coal towns across Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Kentucky were filled with families who barely earned enough to buy flour, let alone meat. Food wasn't measured in taste, it was measured in how long it could last. The water sandwich became the meal of men who worked 12-hour days underground, breathing dust, breaking rock, and praying for daylight. At lunchtime, they'd sit shoulder to shoulder, black soot covering their hands, and quietly eat what they had. No complaints. No waste. Just gratitude that there was something to chew. Back home, wives tried to stretch every dollar, boiling bones for broth, saving bacon grease, baking bread from scratch. But for the miners, this soggy sandwich carried something deeper than hunger. It carried dignity, a reminder that even when times were cruel, they didn't bow to defeat. Today, it stands as a haunting reminder of how strong ordinary Americans once were, people who turned nothing into nourishment and struggle into pride. So next time you open your fridge, remember the coal miner's water sandwich, and the generation that never stopped working, even when their stomachs were empty. It looks simple, just a slice of bread glistening with white fat. But to factory workers of the early 1900s, bread and lard wasn't just a snack, it was survival. In the hum of textile mills and iron foundries, lunch breaks were short and stomachs were empty. Most workers couldn't afford butter, and meat was a rare luxury. So they turned to what they had, a spoonful of pork fat, spread thin across a coarse slice of bread, then dusted with a few salted crumbs or, if fortune smiled, a sprinkle of sugar. That humble piece of bread was rich in calories, keeping laborers fueled through long hours of heat, noise, and exhaustion. It was greasy, yes, but it kept the cold away in winter and gave just enough energy to finish another shift. For many, this meal wasn't just about hunger. It carried the smell of home. The lard came from hogs butchered during family hog killing days, a seasonal ritual where every bit of the animal was used, nothing wasted. Even the drippings were saved in glass jars, sitting proudly on kitchen shelves like liquid gold. Children grew up spreading that same lard on bread, dreaming of butter, but grateful for what little they had. And in those small acts of survival, families built an unspoken pride, a belief that endurance was its own kind of feast. Today, bread and lard may sound unappetizing, even strange. But in those factory towns, it was proof of resilience, a reminder that simplicity once kept America moving. So, before you scroll away, hit that subscribe button, because here at America's Lost Recipes, we bring back the forgotten meals that carry generations through hunger, hardship, and hope. It started with leftovers. A few cold potatoes, half an onion, maybe a scrap of bacon if the week had been kind. But when tossed into a sizzling iron skillet, these scraps transformed into something comforting: potato and onion pan hash. For factory workers, especially during the 1910s and Great Depression era, this humble hash was more than a meal, it was a ritual. After long shifts on the line, families gathered around a flickering stove, the scent of frying onions filling their tiny kitchens. There was no recipe, no measurements, just instinct, a pinch of salt, and whatever could stretch another day. The magic was in the sound, the hiss of potatoes crisping in lard, the scrape of a metal spatula on the pan. It was the music of survival. A mother could take yesterday's scraps and make them feel like Sunday's supper. And after a day spent inhaling smoke, dust, or grease, that simple skillet meal felt like home. For children, hash night meant warmth, both from the stove and from family gathered close. For fathers, it was a moment of rest before another dawn whistle called them back to the grind. No cookbooks recorded it, but every factory town knew its scent. Cheap, filling, and honest, this dish carried working-class America through its hungriest years. So when you see a few leftover potatoes on your counter, remember, once upon a time, those same humble ingredients fed the backbone of a nation. In the dim kitchens of factory towns, beans over grits was more than a meal. It was endurance on a plate. When wages fell short and cupboards echoed with emptiness, this simple dish became a quiet form of survival that carried entire families through the hardest decades of American labor. Beans were cheap, hearty, and dependable. Grits, ground corn boiled into a thick porridge, stretched every meal a little farther. Together, they created something that could fill a stomach, warm a soul, and remind a weary worker that tomorrow was still worth fighting for. In southern mill villages and steel towns alike, mothers stirred large pots before dawn, their hands moving with precision and patience. The beans simmered low and slow, absorbing every trace of salt or bacon grease that could be spared. When poured over steaming grits, the two became one, humble, nourishing, and deeply human. Children often called it factory breakfast, though it appeared at every meal. It carried the scent of smoke and corn, a reminder that comfort did not need wealth to exist. Around those worn wooden tables, laughter still found a way to live between hunger and hope. For many, beans over grits was proof that the poorest kitchen still held power, the power to sustain, to comfort, and to keep a family standing when the world felt uncertain. Every spoonful was a promise that even the simplest food could hold extraordinary strength. Stay with us, because the next forgotten meal reveals how working-class Americans turned desperation into tradition, and made history one plate at a time. It had an unusual name, but Mongolian stew was no joke to those who depended on it. In the crowded neighborhoods near America's factories, this humble stew was a lifeline, a bubbling pot of everything left behind, mixed together to feed as many mouths as possible. No two versions were ever the same. A few diced potatoes, a handful of beans, bits of meat, or a stray vegetable found its way in. Nothing was wasted. Every scrap mattered. In an age when groceries were scarce and wages barely kept families afloat, Mongolian stew became a symbol of creativity born from necessity. The name itself traveled through mining camps and factory towns, whispered in jokes but spoken with respect. It meant a stew made from whatever one could find, a stew that stood between hunger and survival. Mothers would stir the pot through long evenings, stretching one meal into 3, while fathers returned home from the mills carrying fatigue that could not be described. When the stew finally reached the table, no one complained about its taste. It was warm, it was enough, and it was shared. Children learned early that the value of food was not measured in flavor but in gratitude. Each bite carried the effort of a day's labor, and the comfort of family gathered close, even when the world outside offered little kindness. Mongolian stew became part of working-class history, the meal that proved hope could simmer even in the poorest kitchen. Stay with us, because the next forgotten dish comes from those same desperate times, when the struggle to eat sparked the quiet genius of American perseverance. They called it sawdust soup, though there was no sawdust inside. The name came from its look, thin, gray, and watery, a meal so meager that it seemed almost imaginary. Yet for thousands of factory families during the Great Depression, this thin broth kept them alive when nothing else could. In the poorest neighborhoods, meat was rare, and flour was precious. Families saved every drop of bacon grease, every scrape of drippings from the pan. When combined with water, salt, and maybe a pinch of pepper, it became soup. Some added stale bread to thicken it, others stirred in a potato peel or two. It was not about flavor. It was about survival. Factory workers came home exhausted, their hands blistered and lungs filled with dust. They sat at small wooden tables where this faint broth awaited them, humble, steaming, and enough to trick the stomach into feeling full. The taste was nearly absent, but the warmth mattered. It reminded them that even the poorest meal could still carry comfort if it was shared. Children learned patience with every sip. They listened to their parents speak softly about better days that might come, while the thin soup simmered like a fragile promise. It was not a feast, but it was a lifeline, a symbol of persistence when the world offered nothing. Sawdust soup may have looked empty, but it held a quiet strength. It represented the unbreakable will of ordinary people who refused to surrender to hunger. Stay with us, because the next forgotten dish reveals how the simplest ingredients built the backbone of American resilience, one humble pot at a time. When the cupboards were nearly empty, and payday still felt far away, families turned to one dependable friend, cabbage. Cheap, filling, and endlessly adaptable, it became the heart of a dish known in many factory towns as the cabbage and scraps pot. The name said it all. Whatever scraps remained from the week, a sliver of carrot, a bone with little meat, or a handful of leftover rice, went into a single pot with chopped cabbage. Slowly, as it simmered, the broth filled the room with a scent that felt richer than the ingredients deserved. Factory workers depended on meals like this. After 12-hour shifts in hot, deafening mills, they came home to kitchens where food was scarce but hope was stubborn. Mother stirred the pot with quiet focus, turning a handful of vegetables into enough for everyone. The secret was time. The longer it simmered, the better it tasted, and the fuller it made each bowl feel. For children, the cabbage and scraps pot was not a symbol of poverty. It was comfort, warm, familiar, and shared at the same wooden table every night. They did not see what was missing, they saw what was present: family, conversation, and the steady rhythm of endurance. No cookbook ever claimed it, yet it fed millions. It was the meal that stood between hunger and survival, flavored not by luxury but by perseverance. Cabbage and scraps pot reminds us that simplicity once sustained an entire generation. From the poorest kitchens came the richest lessons: waste nothing, share everything, and let gratitude be the seasoning that never runs out. Stay with us, because the next forgotten dish carries another story from the heart of America's most resilient kitchens. When meat was gone but hunger remained, families turned to what was left behind: bones. From those bare, brittle leftovers came one of the most essential meals of the working class: leftover bone broth and greens. Factory towns during the early 1900s were filled with the scent of slow-boiling pots. Bones that others might have thrown away were prized treasures here. Mothers would rinse them clean, crack them open, and drop them into a pot of water with a pinch of salt and maybe a few wild greens gathered nearby. Hours later, the water transformed into a golden broth, thin, yet rich in strength. For factory workers, this broth meant nourishment without cost. After a day of hammering steel, sewing fabric, or breathing coal dust, a bowl of steaming bone broth restored what life had taken. It carried protein from the marrow and comfort from the ritual. Every sip tasted like patience and perseverance. The greens, dandelions, turnip tops, or collards, gave color and vitamins to the otherwise plain soup. Children often complained about their bitterness, but they ate every spoonful because they understood what it meant: another day of survival secured. This dish was not glamorous, but it was honest. It proved that value is not found in what we have, but in what we make of what remains. Leftover bone broth and greens stood as a symbol of resilience, reminding every struggling family that resourcefulness could still bring dignity to the table. Stay with us, because the next forgotten meal, one served over warm biscuits, carried the same message of hope, pride, and the unbreakable spirit of those who built America from hunger upward. It had a strange name, but bulldog gravy was no joke to those who relied on it. In the toughest years of the Great Depression, this humble meal, served over warm biscuits, filled empty stomachs and lifted weary hearts. There was no meat in bulldog gravy, despite its bold name. It began with a spoonful of bacon grease saved from earlier meals, mixed with flour, water, and a pinch of salt. Some added black pepper for flavor. Others stirred in milk if they were lucky enough to have it. The result was a thin, pale gravy poured over hot biscuits made from the simplest ingredients: flour, lard, and determination. Factory workers and farmers alike began their mornings with it. The gravy provided fat and warmth, while the biscuits gave strength for the long hours ahead. It was breakfast for those who could not afford luxury, but still demanded dignity from their day. Children often laughed at the name, not knowing it came from the dish's tenacity. It stuck to your ribs like a bulldog. Even with so little, it filled the body and gave a sense of abundance that no hunger could erase. For mothers, bulldog gravy represented triumph. They turned drippings and flour into a family meal, proving that resourcefulness could outlast any hardship. Around those small kitchen tables, faith and gratitude became the true seasonings. Bulldog gravy on biscuits remains a forgotten masterpiece of working-class endurance, a dish that fed the hands that built a nation from dust and sweat. Before you go, remember, every story we tell here honors the taste of perseverance. So stay with us, because in every forgotten meal, there lies a memory worth keeping alive.